Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you today by MegaPixx Media. Joining me is Mark Milke, who is the Executive Director of Research with the Canadian Energy Centre. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Good to be on. Thanks for having me, Mario.
So new research paper came out this morning, today, on the energy sector and contributions to the government revenue. And maybe I'll let you explain some of the numbers. What did your research find in terms of that contribution?
Sure. Well, first, maybe let's try and put it in context, right? Governments need tax revenues, maybe not as much as all of us would want some days, but they need some tax revenues for some things they spend money on our behalf. And if you think about children's allowance, family allowance payments, or other benefits for children across the country from the federal government, over the past 50 years, they've spent about $500 billion on family allowance and other child benefits. Now, as it turns out, the number from oil and gas revenues and royalties and taxes over the last 20 years alone is about the same number, about $505 billion. So that'll give you an idea, hopefully, of how important oil and gas revenues are to the country. $500 billion in family allowance payments and other children's benefits, and about $500 billion in oil and gas revenues across Canada in about 2/5 of that time. So in this new paper that we've just released today, we also find, and that's just the oil and gas sector, revenues from the oil and gas sector to municipalities, to provinces, to the federal government. Now, the energy sector writ large, so you throw in electricity, you throw in some other sectors in the energy sector, and you've got $700 billion in revenues. So that's the big number, but I'd say for those interested specifically in the breakdown for oil and gas, which is rather important to Albertans, Newfoundlanders, British Columbians, Saskatchewanites, but also to the federal government for their revenues. Yeah. That's the big number, $500 billion.
And I guess the key point here is the impact, that this industry has, overall, in terms of getting money into the hands of governments who then can use that money doing all sorts of things. Like, you did mention a couple of programs there, but, there's a lot of other stuff too that governments need revenue from, right?
Right. Well, exactly. But also keep in mind that if the oil and gas sector wasn't here in Canada, governments would have to find about 30 billion a year, depending on the year, on average, in oil and gas revenues. And where would that come from? Probably your pocket. So when industries like oil and gas flourish, there's less pressure to raise taxes on the rest of us, right, that are not employed in the oil and gas sector. So that's an important point to remember. As well, there are some useful comparisons in this new study from the Canadian Energy Centre. One of them is to give people, again, a context of these big numbers. If you look at, for example, the real estate sector, they pay about $211 billion over the last 20 years in taxes to governments across the country. The construction sector paid about $300 billion, just over under $300 billion to governments across the country. And even if you put the construction sector plus the real estate sector together, they barely paid more, about $510 billion in taxes to governments across the country in the last 20 years, compared to, again, one sector, oil and gas, which paid almost as much. So that's important to realize, that it really is the major driver of revenues to governments across the country.
And while it is the major driver, we're in the middle of federal election campaign, and I hear little about the energy industry and oil and gas sector specifically during this campaign.
Well, maybe that's a good thing, in the sense that you don't want a bad idea to come out in a campaign. And this isn't connected to the campaign at all. I mean, this is based on 20 years of research. So from, again, the year 2000 to 2019, the latest data that we could compile. So it's a lot of money, $500 billion. I mean, there's other ways to look at it as well. I mean, EI payments, about $200 billion over the last 20 years. Again, the oil and gas sector alone paid for, more than that. So now money's fungible. I mean, there's lots of other industries in Canada, but you do get an idea of how big the oil and gas sector is in its revenues to governments when you look at, again, these other sectors like real estate and construction, which are booming, of course. They've been booming in the last couple of years. And they still don't provide, at least over the long term, the kind of money that the oil and gas sector does. In fact, the oil and gas sector is coming back. I think when you look at next year's data, when we do this study again, and you look at 2020 data, you'll see obviously, that there's going to be a bit of a dip in oil and gas revenues because of COVID and because of quasi recession last year. But you're going to see it come back in 2021, right? I mean, at $70 oil prices, all of a sudden governments across the country, and natural gas prices too. A lot of governments base their taxes or royalties on higher oil and gas revenues. And so you're going to see that the low point is probably 2020 for oil and gas revenues, and then you're going to see them jump up again. Making the point that these revenues should matter to governments because they matter to Canadians. You can't pay for family allowance benefits and other child benefits or EI or any of the innumerable programs that exist federally or provincially or municipally without a lot of revenues. So that is, I think, the key takeaway from the paper.
Yeah, and these are massive numbers, right? And but I don't think the average Canadian, maybe the average person in the world, understands, how big those numbers are.
Yeah. Well, again, ask yourself where you get the money to pay EI, right? I think it was 200 billion in our study over 20 years. That sort of thing. Where would you get the money to pay for that if you don't have some of these major industries? And oil and gas, in terms of revenues to government, is the biggest contributor to government revenues that we found. Again, the real estate sector and construction sector have been booming in the last couple of years, and we provide a bit of a breakdown in the paper of the trend lines. And again, the past couple of years have been down for oil and gas, but I suspect 2021. Again, will be much higher in future reports, precisely because of $70 oil, and I forget where natural gas is at these days, but it's what, $3-4. So it's much higher than it used to be, and that provides a lot of revenues to governments.
Yeah. One last thing, Mark, is there anything else from the report that struck you that was interesting that we haven't talked about here?
Well, I mean, I would just say again, some of the comparisons struck me. And again, the big one was to, what we pay out for family allowances. I mean, I remember my parents getting a check for family allowances when I was a kid. So literally our data goes back to 1969 all the way up to 2019 for that measurement. And it's equal to what oil and gas revenues meant in just 20 years. So 20 years worth of oil and gas revenues, in one sense, you could say paid for 50 years or the equivalent of 50 years worth of what was necessary to pay out on family allowance. So it's not insignificant.
Yeah. Anything else coming up in terms of your research? What's next on tap from you guys?
Well, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at foreign oil imports to Canada. That's a paper we did last year. We'll update those numbers soon. We'll look at some European numbers on the same metrics, perhaps 2 months from now. So there's a lot underway at the Energy Center.
Okay, super. Thanks for joining us again, Mark.
Thank you, Mario.
All right, that was Mark Milke, who is the Executive Director of Research for the Canadian Energy Center. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you by MegaPixx Media. Thanks for joining us.